So the excluding of ourselves as part of the force, as it were, of the basic why is a theme um, that's very maybe very worthy of investigating. It's clear that unlike experience, which happens of its own course, a very specific will is in play in experiment. And that will, however, can be forgotten, as it were, and just done in a kind of blind manner. And even this notion that Zizek is very fond of the blind nature seems to arise at a certain moment especially in the 19th century, during the rise of experimental science, where one is given to ask, is the whole point of experimental science to attempt to um, exclude ourselves, um, and then to see what would it all be like if we weren't here? So it's like a kind of transcendental experiment. What would the blind nature be like? What would the nature where we play no role be like? Um, However, it seems that whenever we think nature or make it intelligible to ourselves, we add something of ourselves. So this is like the simile, as it were, the part of it which is always so. Um, Say in our background presupposition, in our background paradigm, as it were, we're always thinking, well, of course, the world is a stage, and the human beings are like actors, and we always take that for granted. So it's back there. So part of deconstruction means um, actively becoming aware of what presuppositions are operating. So such as the inertial frame of reference, such as the vacuum, such as that the physical sciences of experiment operate on the basis of a certain notion that there can be a repeatable mechanical system which can play the role of a clock, so that time is then something that is totally available to the human being. And this is a kind of master presupposition. Whereas what Heidegger wants to say is time isn't a thing which is available to us, but rather being. So rather, he says it's not that we can say this is time, and then we point to a clock, but rather es ist Zeit, it is time, is the same as saying being, or that anything's here at all. He says only that this way of stating it is somehow somewhat better than the other way of saying it, flipping it, but it doesn't quite get us there. We still, in some minimal way, are turning time into a being, but the being we're turning it into, in that case, is like the simile which stands there forever before us. Whether we can push further than always being in the case where we have a simile or some irrational visionary ground is a difficult question. So on the language front here, we can say it's observed that, generally speaking, almost all of our terms, human terms, we use the same word to mean the thing that is supposedly the natural objective thing, a man, for instance, and the moral ethical thing. So so for instance, like in one of Pushkin's stories, he speaks of the Tsar's blackamoor as more resembling a man than anyone in the Tsar's immediate retinue. And you if you listen to and participate in daily speech, it's fairly obvious. In fact, it's arguable that we don't use the word man primarily, but only secondarily to speak of a biological man. But we usually use it to say, is this a real man? And the same with all other terms. So, Bertolt Brecht or Brecht has said that the waiter who thinks that he's a waiter has something wrong with him. Zizek speaks of the ironic distancing in this sense. So this would be a way to break with the power of the norm that's presupposed out of our opinions. And the opinions are not really opinions in the way that the word sounds to us, but it's rather that the way that Plato Socrates thinks of doxa is that it's a mixture, it's a primitive mixture of experience and our own unsystematic thinking. So it's like we experience the world and we see human beings and we see, for instance, waiters, and then we say, this is a really professional waiter, everything's rictish or proper about his waiting. He asks for, what do you want, still water or sparkling water, and he gets it right, and so on. This is a real waiter, or other signs of a real waiter. But it's not done in a scientific experimental way where we try to define in some with some systematic terms what a waiter is. But we could do that too. But all our language, all our ways of making things intelligible to us tend to cover both these spheres, which makes the attempt to, in the sciences, to totally evacuate all experience or doxa or regular opinion very problematic. So here again is the ground of history and even the history of being, where the deconstruction means going back and trying to find out how this has happened and trying to claim it back to ourselves. So part of the crisis, that and the best, I suppose the best single work I would recommend on this subject is Husserl's The Crisis of the European Sciences, and I forget the rest of the title, something about phenomenology. Husserl, of course, was a world-class mathematician, and so he goes into, in great detail, what Galileo was doing and thinking and how this break was made from Aristotle. And of course, a good deal of that break, we could discuss that in detail also. A good deal of it was really made on the basis of the so-called armchair philosophizing, which is a polemical term against philosophy by what philosophy has become, namely experimental science. But when one armchair philosophizes, one is actually thinking about human experience rather than the strict experiment, rather than the double-blind experiment, rather than experiment under a paradigm of some regime of physics or so forth. So hopefully people can, maybe somebody can write in with some questions to direct us towards which points are more or less cogent and which points we should press. So I'll try to push this question in more detail, especially as it shows us what Heidegger is really trying to do in getting to as basic a ground as he can, free of the simile and of all the so-called facts that build upon any given simile as a paradigm.